excellent weather. It's indeed a privilege to hold a talk or a seminar in a place like this. So I'm sure that all of you have really enjoyed being here. I think we are late by a few minutes, but that's all right.
And that will be compensated later. I hope.
You have 35 minutes. Um, One of the debates at the heart of the Indian freedom struggle is that Gandhi introduced a certain religious idiom and a certain uh, uh, a certain encouragement to religion, both of course by taking up the cause of the Khilafat movement and also by taking up the practices which were associated with Hinduism and making them in some way or the other a part of a part of freedom struggle. And there are critics on the left who argue that this was a disservice to the freedom struggle, and of course there are critics like Jinnah and his supporters and admirers who believe that nationalism should have been a purely secular affair having nothing to do with religion. But and today's talk is going to talk about it. The fact is that in a country like India, which was deeply traditional, deeply religious, freedom struggle could not have become a true freedom struggle unless it used the religious idiom, it used the religious institutions, religious practices such as kirtan, melas, ashrams, etc., etc., so as to communicate to the people in their own language. So when Gandhi used the word Ram Rajya instead of constitutional democracy, he could immediately connect with people and he could communicate to them as to what he meant, because everybody, at least in North India, knew that Ram Raj meant ideal rule. There was no doubt in any illiterate peasant's mind about the meaning of Ram Rajya. So it was an excellent way of communication, and also, in any case, nationalism had to be based on the culture of the country. So from the early 20th century, especially, these kind of practices got a lot of boost, and the Swadeshi movement of Bengal played a very important role in this. Some of the practices which were later adopted by Gandhi, um, they go back to the Swadeshi movement of 1905, 1907. And I believe that it is around this time only that in Maharashtra, which was also one of the vanguards of uh, the freedom struggle in India, similar practices started. Of course, in the late 19th century, towards in the closing years of the 19th century, Lokmanya Tilak had started two of these festivals, but then these were followed by other things inspired by Tilak and other people. And one such thing was Rashtriya Kirtan tradition in Maharashtra. And today we have the pleasure of having with us Varada Sambhus, who is our junior fellow, speaking to us on reflections on Rashtriya Kirtan in Maharashtra and its contribution to national freedom movement. So this was a very important tradition which sort of mobilized people, communicated the idea of nationalism to them, mobilized them for the freedom struggle, and inspired them in so many ways. So without further delay, now I would like to invite Varda Sambhush to proceed with her lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. And otherwise, my special thanks to Dr. Mishra because I have been discussing with this. I have been discussing with him this topic, and also to Dr. Shukla, who have been greatly instrumental in finalizing the contours of this talk as well as the topic that I am working on. Special thanks to NMML for giving me the fellowship for working on this topic, and today's talk is obviously based on my ongoing work that I'm doing at NML. As I said, this is ongoing work, so fine lines are still emerging and arguments are still building up. But whatever I have done over the past 1 year, I will be presenting that in front of this August gathering today. So, as the title reads, Reflections on Rashtriya Kirtan in Maharashtra, its contribution to the national freedom movement. Uh, as India celebrates 75 years of independence, a look into multifaceted efforts of various groups and individuals is required. Most works available on India's freedom struggle are based on textual and archival sources. Rare are the works focusing on the employment of oral and performative traditions. During a time when colonial powers limited and closely watched freedom of association, speech, and the press, new ways and platforms were devised to instill a sense of national consciousness. Religious institutions such as mathas, ashramas, sampradayas, as well as religious practices such as kirtans, pravachans, and satsangs seem to be important sites of nationalist activities. However, these practices and institutions have remained underworked in the academic writings of India's freedom movement. An effort to hear the many voices of the national freedom struggle necessitates an inquiry into the religious, oral, and performative traditions that aided the cause of national movement on the one hand, and social reforms on the other. My ongoing work at NML is an effort to bridge this gap. I focus on the ways in which the institution of Kirtan and particularly Rashtriya Kirtan was employed in Western India in the Marathi speaking region to create public opinion for political independence. In today's presentation, I will outline the nature of Rashtriya Kirtan, its genesis, and then, if time permits, I will discuss the contributions of three major Rashtriya Kirtankars, Dr. Dattopant Patwardhan, Gadge Maharaj, and Vasudev Kulatkar. Of course, there is a long list of Rashtriya Kirtankars who emerged between 1900s to 1947, and obviously, because of paucity of time, it is not uh, possible to deal with all of them or to mention all of them. But today, I'll be focusing only on these three. Kirtan. So let's briefly talk about what has been Kirtan and how it has emerged. Kirtan in India. Sage Narada is considered as the progenitor of Kirtan tradition. Srimad Bhagavatam. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Um, Please increase the size.
Srimad Bhagavatam prescribes 9 ways of bhakti known as Navadha or Navavidha bhakti. They are Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakhyam, Atma Nivedanam. So this is Srimad Bhagavatam. Different regions of the Indian subcontinent witnessed the rise of various bhakti sampradayas starting at least from the 8th century. One of the common means adopted by these bhakti sampradayas to disseminate their message was kirtan. Accordingly, tradition of kirtan took a specific form in different parts of India. In different parts of India, some or other forms of katha, kirtan, sankirtan are known by different names. Shabad kirtan, sankirtan, nam sankirtan, das kut kirtan, katha kalkshepam, hardasi kirtan are some of the well-known forms of kirtan. Irrespective of the name and the form, what has remained at the core of Kirtan is devotion to God. The primary objective of Kirtan across various traditions is to sing the glories of God and great bhaktas. Over the centuries, Kirtan has remained primarily a means of spiritual and religious quest. So when we think in terms of Kirtan tradition in Maharashtra, it has taken some particular form. And as far as Kirtan tradition in Maharashtra, we can definitely say the known history of Kirtan in Maharashtra dates back to at least 13th century. The known history of Kirtan in Maharashtra dates back at least to 13th century. Sant Namdev is believed to be the first or Adya Kirtankar in Maharashtra. One finds several references to Kirtan in the compositions of Namdev. Almost all Bhakti sants like Jnaneshwar, Eknath, Tukaram, Ramdas, who lived between 13th and the 17th century Maharashtra, seem to be known Kirtankars of their times. Even though the primary objective of Kirtan remained Bhagavad Bhakti or devotion to God, in the compositions of Eknath and more prominently so in, in the compositions of Ramdas, the spiritual aspect of Kirtan is intertwined with social issues and rarely with political ones. For example, in Dasbodh, which is a voluminous composition and text by Sant Ramdas, who lived in 17th century and is also believed to be the spiritual guru of Shivaji. Of course, keeping the controversies aside, I'm not going into those controversies, but of course, Ramdas even today is uh, popularly believed to be the spiritual guru of Shivaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji. So in this work, he writes, मुख्य ते हरिकथा निरूपण, दूसरे ते राजकारण, तीसरे ते सावधपण, सर्व विषय. This reads as the prime importance should be given to Harikatha, that is singing the glories of God, that is Bhakti. Second comes politics, and this reference as a student of political science is very important for me. The third is alertness and attentiveness about everything happening around us. So this is a message that Ramdas gives to bhaktas, overall devotees, and particularly to mahants. Mahants were those who were laid into the Ramdasi tradition or who were the followers of Ramdas. In the 18th and the early part of the 19th century, Kirtan and Kirtankars in Maharashtra were patronized by the Peshwas. On the occasions of major festivals like Dashera, Gopalashtami, Kirtan was organized in temples as well as at the darbars of Peshwas. Varkari Kirtan, Naradiya Kirtan, Ramdasi Kirtan, Rashtriya Kirtan, Ganapatya Kirtan, Shakta Kirtan, Dasganu Kirtan are some well-known forms of Kirtan in Maharashtra. However, in terms of form of kirtan, they can be classified into two broad categories. So all whatever I have named in terms of different forms, these can be classified into two broad categories, and they are Varkari Kirtan and Naradiya Kirtan. Now, Varkari Kirtan itself needs another hour to talk about because it has a specific form, it has specific tradition. But because today's presentation pertains to Rashtriya Kirtan, which is a subset of Naradiya Kirtan, I will be focusing on Naradiya Kirtan. So let us see what is considered to be Naradiya Kirtan, and then we will move on to Rashtriya Kirtan. As the term suggests, Naradiya Kirtan is believed to be a form of Kirtan performed by sage Narada. However, the present day form of Naradiya Kirtan is very well structured and came into existence only in the 19th century. Govind Bua Hoshing or Govind Tarkashram, who is also known by this name, a known Kirtankar of the 19th century, is credited for formalizing the two-part structure of Naradiya Kirtan, which is practiced even today. Now, this part of the presentation is very important because that is what is going to set the tone for Rashtriya Kirtan. So, what is this structure of Naradiya Kirtan that was institutionalized by Govind Bua Hoshing? This two-part structure was known as Purva Ranga and Uttara Ranga. So, Purva Ranga, also known as Nirupan, is the initial discourse, and Uttararanga, also known as Akhyan, is a narrative. Usually, Purvaranga is a spiritual philosophical discourse, whereas Uttararanga is story of a bhakta or a devotee that supports the principle explained in the Purvaranga. The Purvaranga usually based on the compositions of the saints or santas. The The Purvaranga is usually based on the compositions of the saints, whereas the Uttararanga is whereas in Uttararanga a wide variety of poetry and literature can be employed. So let us focus, as I just mentioned, that Rashtriya Kirtan, which is the topic for the day, is a subset of Naradiya Kirtan. Towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, as Indians started getting more organized against the colonial rule, a variety of means were adopted to create public opinion. The efforts, which were initially directed towards appealing the colonial authorities, gradually shifted to create public opinion and people's participation in the freedom movement. The newly emerging print media played a substantial role in this regard. However, the circulation and the readership of newspapers and magazines dedicated to nationalist thought were limited. Simultaneously, the curtailment of freedom of press and increasing censorship of print media called for alternative ways of addressing people and rallying them for the nationalist cause. Adoption of traditional religious practices like kirtans and pravachans for the national cause seemed a suitable alternative in the era when freedom of organization, speech, and press were curtailed and strictly monitored on the one hand, and colonial state's policy of non-intervention in the religious affairs of the natives on the other. So this non-intervention at least was present in principle, if not in practical terms. It is well known that in the last decade of the 19th century, and as Dr. Mishra also mentioned in his opening remarks, that in the last decade of the 19th century, Tilak popularized public celebrations of Ganesh festival and Shiva Jayanti. It can be said that Tilak spearheaded the initiative of interweaving the message of nationalism along with devotion to God. Tilak, who rose to national prominence in the early years of 20th century, recognized the power of Kirtan and provided an ideological foundation to Kirtan and to suit Kirtan to its time for the nationalist cause. In its new avatar, so Kirtan now is taking new avatar in this particular context of early 20th century. The primary objective of Rashtriya Kirtan, or as the name suggests, nationalist Kirtan, was to spread the message of Kesari, the Maratha daily, which was started by Tilak, Kesari, and Maratha, which was English newspaper started by Tilak. So in the initial phase, the primary objective of Rashtriya Kirtan was to spread the message of Kesari and Maratha to the significant sections of population who were unlettered. In 1918, the first All India Kirtan Sammelan was organized at Nagpur. Tilak himself presided over this Sammelan. Tilak's presidential speech not only stressed the necessity to make the institution of Kirtan more relevant by addressing contemporary challenges, in addition to the primary theme of Bhakti, but also outlined the framework of a new form of Kirtan which came to be known as Rashtriya Kirtan. In this endeavor,
If I may just, what is this slide?
so I'll
What
just
is the
come to
origin
this.
of this slide?
So the source is this is a slide.
It's a contemporary kirtan.
Yes, yes,
isn't it?
yes.
I
So
see.
I'm just portraying the form of Naradiya Kirtan, which is also a Rashtriya Kirtan, and the symbolism there is, I think, self-evident. This is the person at the center is Charudutta Afre, who is a very well-known Rashtriya Kirtankar. And this slide is from his latest Kirtan, and which he himself shared with me. The
Are
source.
there any slides from those days? I mean, which you would like to show?
Very yes, yes. So
Okay,
I will
all
show
right.
some photos
That's all right.
of Kirtankars, not of actual Kirtan performances, because these are very rare to find.
Okay.
So this is just to depict the structure of Naradiya Kirtan and who are accompanying the main Kirtankar. That's the purpose of this. And of course, you can see the topic I have written in the description. So going back to the presentation, around this time, there seemed to be two important debates pertaining to Kirtan. So we are talking about early 20th century, around 1910, 1915. Around this time, there seemed to be two important debates pertaining to Kirtan and particularly Rashtriya Kirtan. The first was regarding the contents of the Kirtan. The Kirtankars of this time were divided on this issue. The traditionalists believe that uh, Kirtan should not be performed for any other purpose than devotion or singing praises to God and thereby attain spiritual merit. On the other hand, nationalists incorporated Desha Bhakti within the corpus of Bhakti and argued that if country or society is not protected, merely singing the glories of God is futile. The second debate concerned with what can be considered as a Rashtriya Kirtan. So basically defining what constitutes the element of Rashtriya. Some Kirtankars argued that any Kirtan that imparts spiritual or social message is also a Rashtriya Kirtan. In this sense, all Kirtan can be considered as Rashtriya Kirtan. Whereas a more strict understanding of Rashtriya Kirtan required Kirtankar to incorporate the themes of national freedom, pointing out the evils of colonial rule, promote and propagate national education, and Swadeshi. Over the years, the second debate seems to be settled, and it was more or less agreed that the primary object of Rashtriya Kirtan or nationalist Kirtan, as the name suggests, is to awaken a sense of nationalism among the audience. A sense that one's personal spiritual merit is said to be affected by one's participation in national endeavors came to be recognized as the core of the Rashtriya Kirtan. Like Naradiya Kirtan, Rashtriya Kirtan is also based on the composition of a Santa. As far as the Purvaranga, the first half of the Kirtan is concerned, there was not much difference between Naradiya Kirtan and Rashtriya Kirtan. However, when it came to Uttararanga, or the second part or the narration part of the Kirtan, Naradiya Kirtan and Rashtriya Kirtan were categorically different. The Uttaranga of Naradi Kirtan was based on Puranic stories of great bhaktas like Uddhav, Prahlad, Pundalik, and so on, and as well as stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata. Whereas in the Rashtriya Kirtan, Uttaranga consisted of stories of great warriors and revolutionaries from the recent past, like Shivaji, Sambhaji, Rana Pratap, Guru Gobind Singh, Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, Vasudev Balwant Phadke, Safikar brothers, Savarkar. Interestingly, Tilak himself became part of the narration of Rashtriya Kirtan, Subhash Chandra Bose, and etc. So, two important things: the figures which were considered as nationalist, like Shivaji, Sambhaji, or Rana Pratap, or even Guru Gobind Singh, they came to be the part of narration in Rashtriya Kirtan, whereas in Naradi Kirtan it was merely Puranic stories. Importantly, Rashtriya Kirtankars sang the glories of revolutionaries. So it is very important when we discuss and debate in the present day context the role of revolutionaries and who played a major role in India's freedom struggle. It is very important that when the revolutionaries were alive, Rashtriya Kirtankars were singing their glories. So, do I have more? Like, how much time do I have now?
Oh, you have enough time. You are just
Great.
halfway.
So it is a unique skill of a Rashtriya Kirtankar to intertwine the message of bhakti with Desha Bhakti. For example, and it's a very small example that I'm giving here. For example, in a Rashtriya Kirtan, an Abhang by Santa Tukaram on strength to fight evil. So in bhakti, we will talk, like generally the santas would talk about fighting shadripus and the evils that one individual has on the path of bhakti. But in Rashtriya Kirtan, this strength to fight against evil can easily be translated as strength to fight the colonial oppression, and devotion to God easily takes the form of devotion to nation or devotion to people. So now let us focus on, so there is another slide and these are from contemporary days. This is another slide and this is Mrs. Krantigita Mahabar. So this is merely to depict the increasing number of women in present day context in Rashtriya Kirtan. So the earlier slide was Charutabu Afre and this is Krantigita Tai Mahabar. Again, thanks to Krantigita Tai for sharing this slide with me, sharing this photo with me. And you can see the main Kirtankar who was actually performing Kirtan in this particular slide. This is Charudatta Bua Afre, but in the second slide, you can see him playing harmonium. So the Kirtankars of the day do take turns and rounds in terms of accompanying the main Kirtankar. So now going to the Kirtankars, the Rashtriya Kirtankars of the past. This is the most prominent figure when we talk about Rashtriya Kirtan, Dr. Dattopant Patwardhan. He was a homeopath by profession, but eventually we know him today as the first Rashtriya Kirtankar or Adya Rashtriya Kirtankar. So I'm going to talk about Dattopant Patwardhan now. Dr. Dattopant Patwardhan was a well-known Rashtriya Kirtankar of Maharashtra. He is considered as the first or Adya Rashtriya Kirtankar or the father of Rashtriya Kirtan. It was Dattopant Patwardhan who was mainly instrumental in reconceptualizing the traditional form of kirtan to suit the social and political needs of his times. So obviously he took guidance from Tilak and Tilak was greatly instrumental in making him a kirtankar. One of the major contributions of Dr. Dattopant Patwardhan was to restructure the Uttararanga, the second part of kirtan. He replaced the traditional way of narrating the stories from Puranas in the Uttaranga to incorporate the stories from relatively recent past, that of Shivaji's, Peshwas, Lakshmi Bai, and other revolutionaries. He was born in a village, so he was born in 1881 in Kolhapur. He went to Calcutta for his medical degree. Around this time, so around 1905 and 1906, which Dr. Mishra also mentioned, Bengal was a hotbed of revolutionaries. And Patwardhan was greatly influenced by the activities of the revolutionaries. After his return to Maharashtra, instead of pursuing medical profession, he preferred to join national school. Please remember, this is also the context where nationalist education or national education is uh, be, becoming prominent, and establishment of nationalist schools is also very evident. And of course, the Deccan Education Society, which was started by Tilak and Agarkar, is already well functioning. And in this cause, Dr. Patwardhan, after returning to Maharashtra, he joins the national school, which was known as Samartha Vidyalaya, and he became a teacher there. While in the school, he presented his first kirtan in 1909 on the occasion of birth anniversary of Ramdas Swami, the one which I quoted earlier. The school where he taught was closed down in 1910 by the British because it was imparting the nationalist education. He took the formal, and then he went on to take formal education in Kirtan by a very prominent Varkari Kirtankar of his time, Vishnu Bhuva Zok in Pune. He considered Kirtan as a powerful means of mass communication. Dr. Dattopant in 1915 formally and fully entered the Kirtankar's profession, motivated by his profound sense of nationalism. Dattopant Patwardhan's disciple and biographer Pundalik Kadgade credits Lokmanya Tilak for for pursuing Patwardhan to take up Kirtan as a full-time profession and to create a nationalist sentiment among the common masses through the means of Kirtan. Kadgade notes that when Tilak returned from Mandale in 1914, Dr. Patwardhan met him. On that occasion, Tilak suggested to Dr. Patwardhan, and I'm quoting, of course, the original quote is in Marathi, and whatever I am presenting as a quote is my own translation. There is a dire need for political awareness among the masses. Like Ramdas did, the people in the villages need to be awakened. You are blessed with a melodious voice. You also have devotion, dedication, and persistence. Put to use these qualities for the national awakening by performing kirtans. Do not worry about income and bread and butter. People will provide you enough. So this is what Tilak told Patwardhan and persuaded him to take up kirtan as a full-time vocation. Dr. Patwardhan used to perform kirtan mostly in open spaces and at times in temples. Deshinger, one of the scholars of national freedom movement and who has a major contribution on writing an essay in one of the books titled Regional Roots of Indian Nationalism. So in this article, Deshinkar notes that Patwardhan Bua's Kirtan fetched large audiences, minimum of 8 to 10,000 people at a time. He had a large following who took a vow of Swadesi. At times, he openly criticized British rule and at others, uh, an indirect way of drawing parallels with Puranic stories. But Patwardhan's performances became a standard component of Congress's meetings, and he had the sole privilege of singing national song Vande Mataram at the beginning and the end of the Congress district meetings. Patwardhan supported several All India nationalist leaders and made daily water offerings to deceased freedom fighters. But he composed and performed more kirtans on Tilak than on any other single person. In his lifetime, Dattopant, so of course, we don't know the exact number of kirtans that he performed from almost 1910 to 1960. This is the period of 5 decades. Dattopant toured in Maharashtra and in Marathi speaking regions. There are rarely Hindi kirtans of him, or I wouldn't say they are Hindi kirtans, but employment of Hindi in Hindi speaking belt. And so we don't really know how many kirtans he performed, but definitely we know at least for 5 decades he was touring around. And in his lifetime, he composed over 114 Uttar Rangas, narrating the stories of revolutionaries and the great nationalist heroes, and if I can use that term, heroines, and about 19 and 90 plus Purvarangas, the spiritual discourses, which were the initial discourses. In fact, most of his akhyans gave the message of fourfold principles laid down by Tilak, namely Swadeshi, Rashtriya Shikshan, Swarajya, and Bahishkar. Dr. Patwardhan also organized special morning courses, and this is very unique feature of most of these Rashtriya Kirtankas, which we see also in other Kirtankas that I will be discussing. Dr. Patwardhan also organized special morning courses and imparted physical education to men and women. And what was the condition to be enrolled for physical education classes for these adolescent boys and girls? The condition was that they eat only hand husk food grains. So that was the condition that he put. And second condition was they went only to the schools which imparted nationalist education and not English education. For over 5 decades, Dr. Patwardhan dedicated his life to the performance of Rashtriya Kirtan and toured the length and breadth of Maharashtra and even beyond. Um, he also trained a number of students and inspired them to take up Kirtan as a vrat. So, if the literal meaning of the term vrata, which is a Sanskrit term, is to dedicate oneself fully to for the cause. So many of his students came to be known as a very popular Rashtriya Kirtan cast in the later days. Vasudev Kulatkar, whom I will be discussing in the next slide, Govind Bua Pathak, Krishna Bua Paturkar, Raghunath Shastri Kairekar, Raji Shastri Sandekar, Govind Swami Afade. Govind Swami Afade was the father of Charudatta Bua Afade, whose slide we just saw. Govind Swami Afre followed in Dattopan's footsteps and continued performing kirtans for the national cause. They emerged as popular Rashtriya Kirtan casts, fetching large audiences of thousands of people. So the second person in this line is Gadge Maharaj. Now, this figure might be known to many of us, and Gadge Maharaj is a unique in this particular Rashtriya Kirtankar genre because of the style he adopted. So Gadge Maharaj himself was an illiterate person. He was unlettered. He could not attend schools. But throughout his life, he gave the message of education and schooling through his kirtans. And of course, Gadge Maharaj, before Gandhi arrived at the national scene, who popularized broom in India, because even in the contemporary politics, we see a lot of broom politics that is happening around. So, who really popularized broom for social cause and for the political cause? The credit can be given to Gadge Maharaj. Debuji Jingaji Zanurkar, that was his original name, alias Gadge Baba, was born in 1876 in Amravati district. So importantly, many other Rashtriya Kirtankas of this time, they were from the western sides of Marathi speaking region. So Pune, Sangli, Kolhapur, etc. The speciality of Gadge Maharaj is he belonged to the Vidarbha part of Maharashtra or eastern part of Maharashtra. Much before Gandhi arrived on the national political scene and advanced non-violence and dignity of labor, Gadge Maharaj had urged people to resolve their conflict by non-violent means, went from village to village cleaning roads, temples and public places, and promoted minimalistic living. He cleaned and swept the towns in the morning. Throughout the day, he helped villagers in their various works and in the evening performed kirtans in local temples. His kirtans were participative in nature. He would ask questions to his audience through the kirtan and point out the paradox of their thinking and action by employing humor. The different issues addressed in Gadge Baba's kirtan were: do not perform religious rites and rituals by going into depth. Take care of your cattle. Educate your children. Send them to school. Stop offering animal sacrifices in any form to the deities. Serve your parents well. Give food to the needy. Do not offer nor accept dowry in marriages. Shun the system of untouchability. Keep away from any addictive substances like alcohol, tobacco, etc. To sing abhangs to all possible times and praise God. And more importantly, to stand up for your motherland. So these were the topics which Gadge Maharaj covered in his kirtans. Gadge Maharaj was well connected with the social and political leaders of his times. In fact, he is believed to have met Gandhiji at least on 2 occasions. Once at Sevagram Ashram and at Faizpur Congress Station in 1936. One of the biographers of Gadge Maharaj documents that some of his disciples took part in political activities and in the struggle for independence. Gadge Maharaj himself, with his followers, attended Faizpur Congress session in 1936 and undertook the task of keeping the venue of the session clean. Similarly, in Nasik Congress in 1950, his followers washed the toilet places for 4 days of the session. Gadge Maharaj himself presented kirtan before the delegates of Nasik Congress. Again, like Dattopant Patwardhan, many well-known Rashtriya Kirtankas of later time are the disciples of Gadge Maharaj. Jebuji Patil, Rajaram Patil, Mahatarba Kumbhar, Mahanand Swami, Yashwant Bua Mani, Vishwanath Bua Wagh, Ramdas Bua Amte, and the list is long. So the point is, what actually sets Garge Baba apart from many of his contemporaries was the audience, was the style that he adopted. So he used to carry Garga, and from Garga is basically a pot, and merely with broken pieces of pot, he would start playing a rhythm, and on that rhythm he would play kirtans. So if you have seen the earlier slide, you would see tabla and mridangam and harmonium, whereas Gadge Baba's kirtan, it was also known as tipri kirtan, because those broken pieces of pots are known as tipri in Marathi. So his kirtan would also be known as tipri kirtan. So he would go and start cleaning the venue, and immediately with his tipri he would start performing kirtan. As I said, he himself worked on the farms for many years together. He was raised by his maternal uncle. His father, he lost his father at an early age, and he himself could not get educated. But because of that, he had this unique skill to impart this wisdom to people in this Vaidarbhya tone or Vaidarbhya. So in Marathi, we have different dialects. So there is this typical Vaidarbhya dialect in which he would impart this wisdom to people. So many people got attracted to Gadge Baba, and especially the caste composition of his audience was totally different than many of his contemporaries. He himself came from a washerman's family, the Dhobi family, whereas most other Rashtriya Kirtankas belong to the Brahmin caste. So that was the major difference in terms of caste composition, and of course that impacted audiences. However, I must say at this juncture that even though other Rashtriya Kirtankas prominently belong to the Brahmin caste, even their audiences were composite in culture, composite in nature. So people from across the caste lines attended Rashtriya Kirtans. The third person in this line, and this is the last person I'm going to talk about. And for this slide, I want to recognize and thank to Ram Kulatkar, who is the younger son of Vasudev Bua Kulatkar, and he shared these slides and photos with me. So Vasudev Shivram Kulatkar, or who is also known as Kulatkar Bua, he was born in 1905. He studied up to matriculation, and it was English education. And around the same time, in 1920, he responded to Gandhi's call to boycott English education and left his matriculation. At a young age, Kolatkar had decided to dedicate his life to the work of national awakening, and for which he employed Kirtan as a means. He took up Kirtan as a full-time profession. He moved to Pune in 1929 and performed Kirtans in and around Pune. During the Satyagraha movement led by Gandhiji, he toured a number of villages in Pune and roped in number of volunteers for Satyagraha by appealing to the audience at the end of the Kirtan. He also collected food grains from the audience, which were then immediately sent to Pune to take care of Congress leaders like Balu Kaka Kanitkar, who was in charge of the camp for the prospective Satyagrahis. Even the small villages and small kirtan gatherings were hardly exceptions to the enlisting of Satyagrahis and collection of food grains during the kirtan. So if we really want to see from where were the Satyagrahis enrolled, it seems that Kirtan and Rashtriya Kirtans were the major sites for enrolling Satyagrahis. In his Kirtans, he freely and openly talked on the issues such as Swadesi, Swarajya, cow protection. He also engaged historical themes alongside Puranic ones. What is like when I was reading for my research, What came as a very prominent fact was that the tradition of public debates in Pune. So Pune is known as a place where public debates are held very frequently. So I came across this reference from 1942. So of course this is very important year also in terms of national movement. So on January 5th, 1942, a public debate for which a public notice was given in a local newspaper was organized in a temple under the chairmanship of Bilavadikar Bua, who was a senior Kirtankar of that time. The issue of the debate was, and I talked about this issue earlier when I talked about two debates, is it possible and justifiable to change the scope and contents of Kirtan with changing times? So the public advertisement is given in the local newspaper, January 5th, 1942, and people are invited to take part in this debate. Uh, Rashtriya Kirtankar Vasudev Kulatkar Bua opened this debate and he quoted the verse that I also quoted of Ramdas Swami. This debate continued for 4 days, and this is very interesting. And this debate is also reported in the local newspaper called Agrani at that time. So this debate continued for 4 days, and eventually the result of this debate was Rashtriya Kirtan was recognized as an important medium of national cause. So it was widely accepted that Kirtan can interpose the message of nationalism and need not limit itself only to the spiritual and the religious domain strictly. So this was the outcome of this debate. One of the major contributions of Kulatkar Bua to the field of Kirtan, apart from performance itself, was that he composed several texts on Kirtan Kala, the art of Kirtan. He wrote kirtans and published them in book forms to be performed on the occasions of birth anniversaries of Ramdas, Shivaji, Lokmanya Tilak, etc. Besides, he wrote biographies of Maharana Pratap, Subhash Chandra Bose, and others. He also translated Mahabharat in Marathi in a verse form, which is titled Abhanga Bharat. He has written an authoritative book, and that's the cover page of that book. He has written an authoritative book on Kirtan titled Kirtan Kala Ani Shastra. In this book, he has discussed the nature and the contents of Rashtriya Kirtan as well. So so of course, whether it was Dattopant who composed about 114 Uttarangas and 90 Purvarangas. Of course, Garge Baba could hardly write. So whatever documented kirtans we have of Garge Baba are written by his disciples, and there are many in number. However, to give a textual support to this Rashtriya Kirtan, the credit goes to Vasudev Bua Kulatkar. And this book is used by the Rashtriya Kirtankas of the day even today. So, in conclusion, I would say, of course, as Dr. Mishra said at the beginning in his opening remarks, many a times and usually Gandhiji is credited for intertwining religion for the political causes. But through this research, I have definitely come to conclusion that much before Gandhi, religion was far more instrumental for the nationalist cause. So, and as I said, whether and importantly, Gandhiji also recognizes this. So, whether singing of kirtan for evening prayers, which Gandhiji adopted as a ritual, whether it is singing of those kirtans or whether singing of bhajans or the idea of Ram Raja, these are not something that Gandhiji himself invents at a particular, it's not falling from the sky. There is a long tradition of intertwining religion and politics. In fact, one of the scholars mentions that from 5th century onwards, when the kings when the rulers started donating for temples huge grants, from that time itself, temple is becoming the site for political awareness and political purpose. Now, when we talk about, and I think it's my duty to explain what I mean by political as a student of political studies. So, political is generally used as a very dirty kind of an affair, which is laid with corruption, which is with power dynamics, etc., etc., where people can kill each other for power, etc. But politics in this particular sense, and the way I'm using, and I have written a separate paper on the way the term Rajkaran, which I quoted from Ramdas in that verse. The term Rajkaran or politics is not something which is dealing only with power to perpetuate the existing structures. If we are thinking in terms of altering the existing structure, in this case, overthrowing the colonial rule and establishing the sovereign nation state, so any form of any effort to bring in alteration in the existing power structure, whether by perpetuating or by bringing in change, can be considered as political. On this note, I would end my discussion here, and I'll be very happy to have questions, and I'll try and address most of them. Thank you, Dr. Mishra, and thank you, audience.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting indeed. We are now open to questions and brief comments from members of the audience.
पहले तो वार्ता को बहुत बहुत बधाई कि बहुत विस्तार से और तार्किक ढंग से इस पूरे व्याख्यान को प्रस्तुत किया। हम सब जानते हैं, और केवल महाराष्ट्र की बात नहीं है, पूरे देश में कीर्तन परंपरा है, और माना जाता है कि नारद से कीर्तन परंपरा शुरू हुई, व्यास ने उसको बढ़ाया। महाराष्ट्र में और गांधी जी ने स्वयं अपनी प्रार्थना सभाओं में और अनेक स्तरों पर उन्होंने प्रयोग करके राष्ट्रीय जागरण को संभव किया। लेकिन विशेष तौर पे महाराष्ट्र में एक बड़े प्रयोग के रूप में ये सामने आया, और समर्थ रामदास की कीर्तन परंपरा राष्ट्रीय चरित्र ग्रहण कर सकी और राष्ट्रीय कीर्तन परंपरा बनी। मैं सिर्फ ये जानना चाहता हूँ, क्योंकि पूरे व्याख्यान में मेरे पास कोई प्रश्न नहीं है, इसलिए नहीं है कि वो हमने समझा उसको उस ढंग से। मैं ये जानना चाह रहा हूँ कि राष्ट्रीय कीर्तन परंपरा जो अपने समय में एक क्रांतिकारी भूमिका निभा सकी, और बताया गया व्याख्यान में, और 3 मुख्य कीर्तनकारों का परिचय भी सामने आया, और लगा कि कितना बड़ा काम उन लोगों ने अपने समय में किया। मैं ये जानना चाह रहा हूँ कि वह जो रामदासी परंपरा है कीर्तन की, जो राष्ट्रीय कीर्तन परंपरा में शामिल हो गई थी, उसके समानांतर एक वारकरी संप्रदाय भी है कीर्तन की, और कई धाराएं हैं वहां। तो इनकी एक समय में जो इतनी बड़ी भूमिका थी जागरण की, स्वदेशी उद्यमिता की, लोक शिक्षण की, सामाजिक कुरीतियों पर प्रहार की, तो आज उनकी क्या स्थिति है? यह मंडलियां और यह जो परंपराएं एक ऐतिहासिक भूमिका में थीं, आज वो कहाँ हैं, किस दशा में हैं? और माना तो ये जाता है कि रामदासी कीर्तन परंपरा गुरुकुल पद्धति से भी सिखाई जाती थी, उनके शिक्षण की व्यवस्था भी थी। तो हम इसको नवोधा भक्ति में नहीं देख रहे हैं, भक्ति से अलग बात कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि उसमें बात करेंगे, क्योंकि ये तो नवोधा भक्ति की दूसरी भक्ति है, दूसरी भक्ति, दूसरी रति मम कथा प्रसंगा, जैसा मानस में लिखा है तुलसीदास ने। उस पर बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ। राष्ट्रीय भूमिका जो थी वो अब कहाँ है, वह किस दशा में है?
Any other questions?
I just have a comment to make. Very nice paper. But I'm sure you're aware that in Bengal, these utsavs had started. Shivaji Utsav, Pratapadittya Utsav, and Veerashtami Utsav. So are they predating the period that you have studied? Are they at the same time? And is it part of a national awakening rather than just restricted to Maharashtra? Second point, briefly, that Iravati Karve wrote an article, which is very famous, on pilgrimage, her pilgrimage, this Varkari thing she went to. And she said it was a real experience for her because she realized that no caste distinctions count over there. So you mentioned Brahmins being the singers and the audience, but is that relevant? Because we have a sociologist herself going on a pilgrimage and saying there was no evidence of caste over there.
Go ahead.
Varda, a very nice presentation. I learned a lot of things. I just want to ask, it just came into my head, at the time when you're saying that the Kirtan Parampara is being incorporated into the National Museum, national movement, there is also, at least in North India, from the civil disobedience days, there is this tradition of Prabhat Pheri that is coming up. So I would like to know if there you found, a spillover, or how these two kinds of traditions have worked together, because the Congress also invested in getting these booklets printed and circulated. And there was, I mean, Prabhat Feris are also kirtan. People would sing Prabhat Feris and go to have a bath in the Ganges. So it probably is different, but I would like you to comment on that.
I think you can take up the questions now.
Okay. So to answer Jyotishji's question, what is the status and what is happening to Kirtan tradition today, and especially in the political context or the nationalist cause? But I'll just give you one example, which is from the lockdown period, because I have been working on Bhakti, and my PhD thesis also pertains to Warkari tradition and the pilgrimage that Meenakshi ma'am mentioned. So I was following the Kirtan cars even during the pandemic. So obviously the offline gatherings or the physical gatherings were not possible because of the lockdown, because of the pandemic. So many Kirtan cars, and this is the beauty, I would say, of Kirtan Parampara or the media of Kirtan, that it adopts to different contemporary forms or means of media. So when radio became popular, Kirtans were on radio. When TV became popular, it was on TV. Now, when YouTube and the slide which I showed of Kranti Geeta ji, Mahabal, it's okay. So the lady whom you saw, that particular slide is from the recording which she did for YouTube channel called Kirtan Vishwa. I myself did this 4-month long online course which was conducted by Charudatta Bua Afle, sitting in Delhi, and that was online for 4 months. So of course, my purpose was not to become a Kirtankar, but to know how the Kirtankars are trained. The point that I'm trying to drive you at is the Kirtan is imparted in multiple ways. So of course, Guru Shishya Parampara still continues in certain corners, but there are other ways, and there are Kirtan universities that are established in Maharashtra. So there are different ways in which Kirtan is being imparted. Going back to this example from the pandemic, so I was just searching different Facebook pages for my own research purpose, and I came across this Kirtan wherein, and that time it was India-China border standoff. So this is just an example what happens in Rashtriya Kirtan. So during this particular period, and of course there was appeal to boycott Chinese apps, right? And this Kirtankar is telling the audience, the virtual audience, it's happening on Facebook page live, and this Kirtankar is telling audience online that if you are boycotting, if you are deleting Chinese apps from your mobile, what you are doing rather is devotion to God. So what is happening to Rashtriya Kirtan? I think this message is loud enough. But of course, it's not all goody picture. It's not all sweet picture. There are multiple debates. There are debates revolving around different traditions. These are called pathadis. So one pathadi arguing against the other pathadi. In fact, the egos, and sorry to all those who are helping, all those kirtankars who are helping me in this work, but the egos of big kirtankars and their clashes, these are, but I would say it's not something that pertains only to kirtan. That happens in any institutionalized form, and wherever there is power play, that's part of our routine life, and that is also reflected in kirtan and different traditions. So that's not something which is unique. Should that be devoid of power politics because it is kirtan? Probably that's our wish and idealistic understanding. So at this, I end. Going to Meenakshi ma'am's question. Uh, as far as, yes, you mentioned about celebration of Shiva Jayanti. I'm not sure because I haven't really looked at Bengal. Probably these are taking place simultaneously. And you are absolutely right. It's not something which is regional phenomena. I'm very sure that through kirtans, through kathas, through Ram Leelas, the nationalist thoughts is disseminated. So, what is the form which is adopted for disseminating that message can differ from region to region, and what is the most popular form in that particular region. Obviously, people would adopt that, and the leaders that time would adopt that. But I restricted primarily because of the language ability. I restricted it to Maharashtra or the western part of India. The second question was about Iravati Karve and the caste question. Yes, the pilgrimage that you mentioned, and thanks for that question because I worked on this Pandharpur pilgrimage extensively for my PhD. And Iravati Karve's article is one of the major sources that I base my arguments on. Caste, so even though Karve mentions that there was no caste distinction as such, yes, in Varkari tradition particularly, people touch each other's feet irrespective of caste, age, gender, status, education, etc. So that's a usual tradition in Varkari Sampradaya. However, Karve also mentions about this dindis. Dindis are small groups which walk in the pilgrimage, which were based on caste lines. Or even if there are mixed caste dindis, there is evident differences of dining and mingling when it comes to caste. So people are open. So where if somebody is in trouble, people would just go and help that person irrespective of caste. But at the same time, somewhere deep down, there was some manifestation of caste, which Karve herself mentions in this article. As far as Kirtan is concerned, yes, even though most is Kirtan caste belong to Brahmin caste, does that mean that the Kirtan itself took Brahminical form? Because I would uh, strongly debate that kind of an understanding. Yes. So going to Samya, thank you for your question. Prabhat Fairies, probably, as I said, Prabhat Fairies is much later phenomena. And in fact, I also came across a reference. I'm still fine. I just came across in some secondary literature reference to that particular kirtan, which was performed in 1948 in Delhi. And the reference was Dattopant himself performed that kirtan in front of Nehru. But this is from the secondary source, so I really don't weigh that. I'm still looking for archival sources if I can get any, and I'm just trying to look for NML archives for that. Uh, so Kirtan has been employed by Congress even in post-independence period. So the themes of Kirtan in post-independence period have been scientific temper. So the Nehruvian vision of socialist scientific India, that is something that gets reflected in Kirtans and especially Dattopant. Like, of course, Kulatkar Bua is staunch opponent of Congress because eventually he joins Hindu Mahasabha. Later on, he joins another kind of Hindu outfit, Hindu political outfit. But as far as Dattopant is concerned, though he was disciple of Tilak, he greatly aided Gandhiji and throughout. So he did not like Gandhiji's ways of ahimsa. But as far as Gandhiji's understanding of self-sufficient villages or Ram Raj was concerned, he strongly supported Gandhiji. So throughout Dattopant's career, we see a strong support to the Congress's cause, not just Gandhiji's. So that's how it is. So yeah, Prabhat Fairies I think is much later phenomena than Rashtriya Kirtan.
शुक्ला जी, बहुत अच्छा वर्दा।
Thank you, sir.
1876 में ड्रामेटिक परफॉर्मेंस एक्ट आता है और ये ठीक उसी समय बंगाल में जो यात्रा हो रहा है, ड्रामा पर तो बैन लगाया जा रहा है, लेकिन उसमें बातचीत कर रही है सीआईडी, सीक्रेट और जो प्रशासनिक हल्के हैं उसमें कि यात्रा को किया जाए कि नहीं। और ये जो यात्रा है वो रिलीजियस टाइप का जो है और उसमें नाटक होते हैं छोटे छोटे और गाने होते हैं और वो सारा कुछ।
और खासकर जब 1905 के बाद 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 में आपको नेशनल आर्काइव में ढेर सारी ऐसी फाइल मिलेंगी जिसमें यात्रा की बैनिंग के बारे में बात है। मेरे दिमाग में ये बात उठ रही है कि चूंकि तिलक और बाकी लोग जो कीर्तनकार हैं ये नेशनलिस्ट टाइप की कीर्तन कह रहे हैं, एक भीड़ सुन रही है उनको, तो उस पर क्या असर हो रहा है, उन लोगों पर कितने लोगों को वो कर पा रहा है, जो मैसेज जाने की कोशिश की जा रही है कितने लोगों तक कर पा रही है। दूसरे, प्रशासन उसको कैसे ले रहा है, मतलब सीआईडी रिपोर्ट्स में, सीक्रेट रिपोर्ट्स में, प्रशासन में, नीचे के लेवल पर, चीफ सेक्रेटरी के लेवल पर, जैसे मान लीजिए कि नाटक आ रहा है तो उस पर मुकदमा चल जा रहा है, या कोई भी भीड़ कर में कुछ कही जा रही है तो वो सीआईडी रिपोर्ट में आ रही है, ढेर सारे लोग अगर इकट्ठा हैं एक जगह पर। तो इस तरह की जो रिपोर्ट्स हैं, या आखिर जो कोशिश थी नेशनलिस्ट लीडर्स की कि लोगों तक बात पहुंचे, वो किस हद तक बात पहुंच रही थी और प्रशासन उसको कैसे ले रहा था, अगर आप इस पर कुछ बात कर पाए तो।
You want me to address it?
No, no, you can answer. I think that there are. Is there any other question? Yes, please come up. Use the mic. No, just come and use the mic.
Yeah, I am Piyush Girgaonkar. I work with Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe, President ICCR. First of all, congratulations for such an extensive work and also best wishes to the coming research endeavors. It is absolutely heartening to see Kirtan being discussed here, rich tradition in Maharashtra. My question is about the democratic governance that comes through the Kirtan Parampara. As we all know that Kirtan is more or less a public participation exercise, which is a cornerstone of democratic governance. So, did you find any particular comments that came from Rashtriya Kirtan Kars that spoke about democratic governance that might be relevant for today's contemporary democratic governance? Thanks.
Any other question? Do we have any online questions? Okay, go ahead and answer.
Okay. So I'll go in the reverse order. Piyush, do you intend to ask in the contemporary context or pre-independence? Okay. Okay. The very fact I mentioned about this public debate in 1942. So I think that itself, so because again, as a student of political studies, I do work on deliberative democracy and deliberation as important aspect of democracy, which is recognized across the globe in all democracies. So where does the deliberation lie? Where does the authentic deliberation that can be considered as rational debate in Habermasian sense, where does it lie? Can the religious sites be considered as sites for deliberation? And if religious sites can, so of course Habermas had his own reservations for considering religious site as rational sites for deliberation or public debates. He doesn't incorporate them in the idea of public sphere. But as far as later scholarship, somebody like Charles Taylor, if you look at him, religion is now very well. So there is reason to religion. So that is something which is well established. And as far as democratic governance is concerned, if we consider Kirtan as a site of deliberation, is the public opinion being created there or not? That's the very important question. And for years, for centuries together, Kirtan has been the site where public opinion, whether it is social values, whether they are moral values or the spiritual understanding of individuals, and also reflecting upon the present day king. In fact, many Kirtankars, including during Peshwa period, they used to give advice to the Peshwas, the leading Kirtankars of the town. So that tradition has been there. So in that sense, it can be considered as a site where deliberation takes place, which is important for democratic functioning. Because so unfortunately, in our present day discourse, we believe that the parliament or the judiciary or the academic campuses are the only sites for deliberation. But that is not the case, and over the years we do so. Of course, going back to Habermas's idea of cafes, the informal sites of deliberation are important parts of civil society. And when we look at India particularly, the religious sites are very important to make public opinion. So Dr. Mishra also mentioned this in his opening remark, that country and the society like India, wherein almost every second action of ours is intertwined with some understanding of morality. The question is, where does this morality come from? So it doesn't fall, it's not hanging out in the air. So that's answering to your question. Shukla sir, thank you very much for this pointed question. In fact, what I am still, and I really want to acknowledge this with all humility, that I have not been able to go to the National Archives so far, which I hope to do in next 1 year. But in the references that I have got so far, one, what was the impact of these kirtans? So there are records, and somebody like Ram Kulatkar, who is son of Vasudev Bua Kulatkar, or also somebody like Charudatta Afle Bua, who is the son of another prominent Rashtriya Kirtankar, Govind Swami Afle. They both have told me that they can actually take me to people who took vows of not drinking tea after the kirtan, or who adopted the vrata of khadi, and they followed that dedication to khadi throughout their lives. So this was the impact of their kirtan, and it was very ecstatic performance. So people were moved, and there are number of accounts, and as I mentioned, there would hardly be a village which would not donate food grains for the kirtan. So it's not for the kirtan itself, but for the satyagrahis who are camped in some other part of Maharashtra. So that was, so indirect way it is like enrolling people for the purpose. So it's, if not actually going for some activity as such, in indirect ways through kirtan cars and through kirtans, these activities were carried out. As far as CID reports are concerned, yes, there are accounts. Even Kulatkar Bua as well as Patwardhan Bua were under the surveillance of British. And there are accounts, as I said, I'm still yet to find the exact files and etc., but I'm hoping to do that in next 1 year. There are no bannings as such, but police reports were regularly mention kirtan caste, and especially after 1918, when Tilak presided over first All India Kirtan Sammelan. So suddenly the eyes are all on, not all, on kirtan caste. So far I haven't come across any such references. Yes.
All right. Some questions and comments from my side. You, in this very interesting lecture, as I said, you have mentioned how the colonial state at least made the pretension of not interfering in the religious matters of the people, and that facilitated the use of religious practices and idiom by people such as Tilak initially and later Gandhi and others. And of course, Rashtriya Kirtan is associated with that. Now, and then you also went on and mentioned later about land grants which were given from the Gupta period onward, especially to temples. Uh, the point about it all is that religion had never been separated from politics in this country, because the way religion was actually conceived in Indian civilization was so fundamentally different from the way it was conceived in the West. And that, leads us to what you said about Habermas and others about the idea of public sphere. Because in the West, once Renaissance started, Reformation started, a certain contradiction was seen between religion and reason. And if you wanted to establish reason and rationality, which became dominant, you can say, from the second half of the 18th century in Europe, then religion had to be sidelined. So I'm not surprised that Habermas does not include religious sites as sites of democratic deliberation. But you are very right in saying that there is no contradiction as far as Indian history and civilization are concerned between religious sites and non religious sites. Both were possible, or both were open to the possibility of public reasoning, public deliberation, and deliberation which could take everybody along, and which is the essence of democracy. Of course, democracy has now acquired a very specific meaning, so I do not want to say that democracy sort of goes back to all that, but those were things which facilitated it. So, this is one thing that we have to keep in mind, that in India, religion had always been associated with politics, and that was precisely the reason there was no conflict between giving land grants to temples by the kings. You see, unlike in the West, where giving more power to the church actually took away from the power of the state, in India it was the other way around. The more power you gave to temples, the more land grants you gave to Brahmins, the more the power of the kings in a locality was actually strengthened.
Recognized.
In fact, R.S. Sharma, while you know writing his thesis of feudalism in India, makes precisely this point, that because land grants were given to temples and Brahmins, uh, kings became more powerful because temples and Brahmins had this stabilizing effect upon the local population. They imparted values, norms, high culture, agricultural practices, etc., etc. So they played that constructive role, and that is why in the Indian history, the kings generally saw religion not as in conflict with the royal authority, but in consonance with the royal authority. They boosted the royal authority, and you would know that the Smritis, many of the Smritis, they were supported by the kings, etc. And the kings had to adjudicate about social status of different varnas. That had also been an accepted practice in India for thousands of years. So this is one thing I would like to say about the separation of religion. Now, why is it that the colonial state claimed that they did not want to interfere in the religious matters? To my mind, there were two reasons behind it. One is that by the 18th century, when the British conquered India, all those developments which I have earlier talked about, they had already happened in Europe. So a certain consciousness had developed that religion has to be separated from politics. But second reason was that they were ruling in an alien country, and if you look at the revolt of 1857, the way the British interpreted it was that it was their interference in religious matters which had actually ignited the revolt, and therefore they made this claim, and to some extent they followed it, I would say, of not interfering in the religious matters of the country. But in many ways, it was a hollow claim. They interfered by trying to colonize the religious spaces and practices, but by pretending to remain neutral. So you see, they won over different communities to their side. They started cultivating Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and other people. So it's not that they did not interfere. They interfered to their advantage, I would say. And now, related to this is another question that comes to my mind. You know, contrary to many people, I'm not at all surprised that in Maharashtra and Bengal, these nationalist religious practices, or the adoption of or adaptation of religious practices and idioms for religion started in Bengal and Maharashtra. It doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, what does surprise me is, why did it start so late in Bengal and Maharashtra? Because you see, these two were the best placed parts of the country in terms of having this kind of a consciousness for two different reasons. Bengal, as Meenakshi ji mentioned, of course, had its own tradition of utsavs and all. Bengal was best placed because it was the first province which was conquered by the British. So it was first exposed to Western knowledge, and it also developed a certain national sort of identity before any other province. So you see that if we keep that in mind, the emergence of or the adaptation of religion to the political idiom or political movement in Bengal also comes very late, towards the end of the 19th century, and in Maharashtra 1 or 2 decades after that, but closely followed by it. Now, Maharashtra was also very well placed for a very important reason. One, of course, Maharashtra had seen a political renaissance from 17th century onward with the rise of Shivaji, and 18th century, in fact, in North India, if I can put it that way, was the Maratha century. Marathas were the dominant political power in the 18th century, and it is finally only in 1818 that the British were able to defeat the Marathas. So you can see that when, for example, this Dattopant Patwardhan was born in 1878, there would still have been people living in Maharashtra who were born before the British had actually
Okay.
conquered, parts of Maharashtra. So what surprises me is not that finally this thing developed in Maharashtra and Bengal. You see, North India had faced deprivation, devastation, all kinds of problems for several centuries. So it is very natural that these things developed very late in North India. But why is it that they developed so late in Maharashtra and Bengal? Have you thought about it? This is one specific question which I would like you to answer. One last comment that I wanted to make. You see, uh, Gandhi's claim to greatness is not that he invented things, by the way. Gandhi did not invent either truth or ahimsa or religion or kirtan or anything of that sort. His greatness lies in bringing everything together and creating a great synthesis. So even the bad things became good when he created that synthesis. As the great bhajan of Surdas says, no, Sab nadiyan jal barbar rahiyan sagar kehi dikhari. So all the rivers, when they came together, they changed their color in the hands of
Dynamics.
Gandhi. So he did not make any claim. Maybe some of his followers make that claim that he invented all these things. So far as I have read him, he always acknowledged, that his
Yes, yes.
predecessors had come up with these things. But the great thing about Gandhi, one thing was this, that he created a synthesis of everything, and his personality epitomized the essence of all this, the essence of being an Indian, the essence of being a Hindu, etc. But the other great contribution that he made, and I think this should be remembered, is that he was the one who awakened the Hindi heartland. Maharashtra and Bengal were already awakened to some extent because of the reasons I mentioned. But without the awakening of the vast Hindi heartland, there would have been no freedom struggle. The freedom struggle would have been confined to the, presidency states of or presidency, you know, uh, uh, cities of
Provinces.
presidencies of Maharashtra and Bengal. So his greatest contribution was basically not only politically awakening, but also bringing the religious idiom, the religious practices, etc., into politics in North India, and for which, by the way, he faced a lot of opposition from both Bengal and Maharashtra. This is a little known fact of Indian history, that all his life Gandhi had to face opposition from Bengal and Maharashtra. Of course, he had a large number of followers in both the places, but there were some staunch opponents of Gandhi in both Bengal and, C.R. Das initially, and then Subhash Chandra Bose. It was an ideological as well as there was a regional, side to that, opposition of Gandhi also. And finally, as you can see, that he faced opposition from Maharashtra also, and we know how he ultimately died. So I'm not trying to generalize upon it, but just trying to tell you that there were many layers and strands there, which probably also need to be kept in mind, and maybe you can incorporate some of this in your further research. But that Maharashtra question, Maharashtra and Bengal, why did it originate so late? That I would like you to attempt to
Sure.
answer.
For your long question, I have a very simple answer, and that's something that I can reflect upon. Um, why so late? Probably because we know the institutional history of later period. The institutionalization part of it might have happened by late 19th century and early 20th century, but the discrete efforts by different individuals were already present. I can give you one simple example. Say, for example, Vasudev Balwant Phadke, who is a very well-known revolutionary. He came from the families of Kirtan caste. Now, the documented history does not say whether his father performed Rashtriya Kirtan in the sense that we are using the term Rashtriya, but definitely he had that impact of Kirtan tradition. That much is something that we can surely argue for. So institutionalization part happened probably later, and that's why we think, why so late? Maybe we don't know the discrete efforts of discrete individuals. So that's my very
Anyway,
basic and simple answer to your question.
that's all right. I think um, we have had a very interesting discussion today, and all of us have participated. And we are really happy that we were here this afternoon to hear your lecture and to participate in this discussion. And I thank all members of the audience for their presence this afternoon. And of course, we will continue the discussion and personally with you. And right now also, we have tea. We'll continue the discussion over tea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.